The Boy Who Followed the Wind. Deep in a quiet valley lived a young boy named Silas. Silas was a curious child who spent his days watching the clouds. One afternoon, a sudden gust of wind ruffled his hair and tugged at his scarf. "Where do you come from, and where are you going?" Silas whispered. He decided right then that he had to find out. Silas went to his father, a lion, who was busy tending the garden. "Father, where does the wind live?" Silas asked. Elian smiled and pointed toward the distant blue mountains. "I could tell you stories from my books, Silas," Elian said, "but to truly understand the wind, you must go and feel it for yourself." Silas packed a small bag with an apple and a canteen of water. He began his journey by walking into the whispering woods. The trees were tall and ancient. The wind here didn't just blow, it sang. It moved through the leaves with a soft shh sound, like a mother calming a baby. High up on a sturdy branch, Silas spotted a falcon with shimmering feathers. "Hello," Silas called out. "I am Silas, and I am looking for the wind's home." The bird tilted its head. "I am Aura," the falcon replied. "The wind has many homes. Would you like to see the one atop the world?" Silas followed Aura as she soared toward the high peaks. The air grew thin and the sun felt bright, but the wind changed. It was no longer a soft whisper. It was a cold, powerful roar that pushed against Silas's chest. He had to lean forward just to keep walking. "Is this where the wind lives?" Silas shouted over the howling air. Aura circled back to him. "This is just one of its voices," she chirped. "To know the wind, you must also feel its gentleness." They began to descend the other side of the mountain, toward a wide, golden valley. In the meadow of sunbeams, the wind was completely different. It was warm and carried the sweet, heavy scent of jasmine and wild honey. Silas closed his eyes and took a deep breath. The wind tickled his skin and made the tall grass wave like a golden ocean. Aura led Silas further until they reached the edge of the great ocean. Here, the wind tasted of salt. It brought the spray of the crashing waves onto Silas's face. "The wind travels across the water to bring news of far-off lands," Aura explained, flapping her wings. After many days, Silas returned to his valley. He found Elian waiting by the garden gate. "Did you find the wind's house?" Elian asked. Silas shook his head and laughed. "The wind doesn't have a house, Father. It has a song in the woods, a strength on the mountain, and a scent in the meadow." Silas realized that he could have read 100 books about the wind, but he never would have known the sting of the cold or the sweetness of the flowers. He learned that the world is a giant book, and the only way to read it is to walk through the pages yourself. The Boy Who Followed the Clouds. A few seasons had passed since Silas first followed the wind. He was a bit taller now, but his heart was just as curious. One morning, he sat on his favorite rock, watching the heavy white clouds drift slowly across the sun. "I know where the wind goes now," Silas whispered, "but where do the clouds go when they vanish behind the hills?" Silas found his father, Elian, fixing a wooden fence near the barn. "Father," Silas asked, "do the clouds have a place where they go to sleep?" "My maps don't show a cloud kingdom." Elian leaned on his hammer and looked at the sky. "A map is just a picture of a place, Silas. To know the clouds, you must walk through the mist yourself." Silas packed his bag and headed toward the misty peaks, where the clouds always seemed to gather. As he climbed the lower slopes, a silver-winged bird named Sira fluttered down and landed on a signpost. "Are you looking for the edge of the sky?" Sira chirped. Silas nodded eagerly. "I want to see where the clouds end." "Follow my wings," Sira called out, taking flight. Silas followed her higher and higher. The air became cool and damp. Soon, They reached a place where the ground was hidden by a thick white blanket. It wasn't the cloud kingdom Silas had imagined. It was a world of gray and white, where everything felt soft and quiet. Silas reached out his hand, expecting to touch something soft like wool, but his fingers passed right through the cloud. It felt like cold steam on his skin. He realized the clouds weren't solid islands in the sky. They were made of millions of tiny, dancing drops of water that tickled his nose. "Look down there," Sierra chirped, hovering over a steep cliff. Silas peered through a gap in the mist. Below them, the clouds were beginning to change. They grew dark and heavy, and suddenly they began to fall. "They are becoming the rain," Silas exclaimed. He watched as the clouds turned into a silver curtain that washed the valley below. Silas stood in the rain, laughing as the water soaked his hat. He saw how the clouds didn't just disappear. They became the streams that moved the water wheels and the puddles where the frogs played. The clouds weren't leaving the world. They were just changing their shape to help the earth grow. As the sun began to set, Sierra landed on Silas's shoulder. "The clouds go everywhere, Silas," she whispered. "They travel across the sea, turn into ice on the peaks, and rise again from the morning dew. You can't find them on a map because they are always moving." Silas finally understood that the journey was the only way to see the truth. When Silas returned home, Elian was waiting on the porch with 2 mugs of warm cider. "So," Elian asked, "did you find the Cloud Kingdom?" Silas shook his head and took a sip of his drink. "No, Father. I found something better. I found out that the world isn't something you look at. It's something you breathe and feel." Silas opened his journal and drew a picture of a cloud, but he didn't color it in. He knew that no color could capture the feeling of the mist on his face or the sound of the rain on the leaves. He realized that to truly know the world, you have to step outside and let it happen to you. The boy who followed the river. Another season had turned, and Silas was taller still. He spent his afternoons by the sparkling blue river that wound past his home like a long silk ribbon. He knew the wind's secrets and the clouds' dance, but the water puzzled him. "The river is always running," Silas remarked to the dragonflies. "It must be very late for something important. I wonder what it finds at the end of its race." Silas found his father, Elian, washing pebbles by the garden path. "Father," Silas asked, "the maps show the river ending in a big blue blotch called the sea. But what is the sea really like? Is it just a very big puddle?" Elian dried his hands and smiled. "A map can tell you where a thing is, Silas, but it cannot tell you how it feels. To know the river's end, you must let the current show you the way." Silas tied his boots tight and followed the riverbank. Before long, he met a sleek, brown otter with bright eyes named Lear. Lear was sliding down a muddy bank with a joyful splash. "Are you chasing the current too?" Lear chirped, shaking water from his whiskers. Silas grinned and adjusted his pack. "I want to see the big blue blotch at the end." "Then you must come with me," Lear said, hopping onto a fallen log that bobbed in the water. Silas climbed aboard, and they began to drift. The river carried them through deep, quiet forests where the trees leaned in to whisper. Silas thought he understood the river now. It was a gentle path, a slow song that hummed beneath their feet. But the song soon changed. The hum became a roar, and the gentle path began to tilt. "Hold on tight," Lear barked, his paws gripping the bark. Ahead, the river didn't just flow, it leapt. Silas saw the water turn into white foam as it tumbled over a great stone shelf. The map hadn't mentioned the thunder of the falls or the way his heart would jump in his chest. They didn't fall, for the log caught in the rocks at the top, and Silas scrambled to the side just in time. He stood behind the curtain of the waterfall, where the world was made of silver light and cool spray. He pressed his hand against the wet stone. "It's so loud," Silas whispered, "and so powerful." He realized that reading the word waterfall was nothing like feeling the mountain shake beneath his feet. As the river widened and slowed into a marsh, Silas and Lear waded through the shallows. The water here was warm and tasted of salt and earth. Silas watched as a school of tiny silver fish darted around his ankles. "The river isn't just traveling," Silas observed. "It's feeding the birds and giving the fish a home. It's much busier than the maps let on." Finally, the trees vanished and the world opened up. The river didn't end. It simply opened its arms and became part of something vast and endless. The sea wasn't a blue blotch at all. It was a rhythmic giant that breathed against the sand. Silas and Lear sat on the shore, watching the waves roll in. "It's bigger than the sky," Silas said breathlessly. Silas returned home with sand in his boots and a jar of salty water. Elian was waiting by the river's edge. "Did you find the end of the map, Silas?" his father asked. Silas shook his head and poured the seawater back into the river. "The map was only a whisper, Father. To know the river, I had to let it splash me. I had to feel how strong it was and how salty it became." That night, Silas didn't look at his maps. He sat by the window and listened to the rain, knowing exactly where every drop was going. He understood now that lessons are found in the doing, the seeing, and the feeling. The world wasn't a book to be read. It was an adventure to be lived, one splash at a time. The boy who followed the stars. The sun had dipped below the hills, and Silas was older now, with a heart that beat for adventure. He lay on the cool grass, watching the first few stars blink into existence. He had followed the wind, the clouds, and the river, but the silver lights above were his greatest mystery. "The stars are so bright at night," Silas whispered to the crickets. "But where do they hide when the sun wakes up? Do they sleep in a box, or do they fly to the other side of the world?" The next morning, Silas found his father, Elian, polishing an old telescope. "Father," Silas asked, "the books say the stars are always there, even in the morning. But I've looked and looked, and the sky is only blue. Are the books playing a trick on me?" Elian handed Silas a small compass. "A book can give you a fact, Silas, but it cannot give you the truth of the light. If you want to know where the stars go, you must follow them until the day finds you." Silas set out that evening, walking toward the highest peak of the Purple Mountains. As he climbed, a tiny glowing light began to dance around his head. It wasn't a star, but a firefly with wings that shimmered like moonlight. "I am Lyra," the creature buzzed softly. "Are you looking for the fallen ones?" Silas nodded eagerly. "I want to see where they go when the light changes." "Then we must move fast," Lyra chirped, leading the way upward. They climbed past sleeping owls and silent pines. The air grew thin and cold, and the stars seemed close enough to touch. Silas felt the mountain's heartbeat beneath his boots. He realized that a map of the mountain was just a flat piece of paper, but the climb was a living, breathing thing that made his muscles ache and his spirit soar. As they reached the summit, the horizon began to glow with a pale orange light. One by one, the stars began to fade. Silas reached out, trying to catch the last glimmer of the Great Bear. "Wait!" he cried. "Don't go yet." But the sun rose higher, and the sky turned a brilliant, blinding gold. The stars vanished, leaving behind nothing but a vast, empty blue. Silas slumped onto a rock, feeling defeated. "They're gone, Lyra. I missed them." Lyra didn't look sad. She buzzed toward a deep, dark crevice in the side of the peak. "The stars don't leave, Silas. They are simply waiting. Follow me into the shadow veil." Silas squeezed through the narrow opening into a hidden cave. It was pitch black, and for a moment he felt a shiver of fear. He had read about caves, but he had never felt the heavy, cool stillness of the earth wrapping around him like a blanket. Deep inside the cave, Lyra's glow grew brighter. She flew toward the ceiling, and Silas gasped. Thousands of glowing crystals and bioluminescent moss hung from the rocks, mimicking the night sky. "Is this where they hide?" Silas whispered, touching a glowing stone. "No," Lyra replied. "This is just to show you that light is always there, even when you cannot see it. The stars are behind the blue of the day, just like these stones were behind the dark of the cave." They stepped back out into the bright morning. Silas looked up at the sun and squinted. He couldn't see the stars, but he felt the warmth of the sun and the vastness of the space above. He realized that the stars hadn't run away or hidden in a box. They were simply outshone by a closer light. "I see now," Silas said. "The world is full of things we can't see, but we can know they are there because we've walked the path." Silas returned home as the sun was setting once again. Elian was waiting on the porch, watching the first star of the evening appear. "Did you find their hiding place, Silas?" Elian asked. Silas sat beside his father and watched the sky turn purple. "They don't have a hiding place, Father. They are always there. I had to feel the cold of the mountain and the dark of the cave to understand that the sky is never truly empty." That night, Silas tucked his compass into his drawer. He didn't need to check his books to know the truth of the universe. He fell asleep dreaming of the silver lights that watched over him, even when the sun was high. He knew now that the best lessons aren't found in the telling, but in the doing. The stars were no longer a mystery on a page. They were friends he had met on the mountaintop. The boy who followed the rainbow. The storm had passed, leaving the air smelling of wet earth and sweet pine. Silas, now a seasoned traveler of the hills, stood by his window as a magnificent arch of color stretched across the valley. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet painted the sky. "I've seen where the wind goes and where the stars hide," Silas whispered, his eyes wide. "But where does a bridge made of light touch the ground? I must find the end of the rainbow." Silas found his father, Elian, in the garden, shaking raindrops from the rose bushes. "Father," Silas said, "the books say a rainbow is just sunlight hitting rain, but it looks like a path. If I follow it, will I find a pot of gold?" Elian smiled and pulled a small, triangular glass prism from his pocket. "A book can tell you why the colors appear, Silas, but it cannot show you how they feel. Take this. The rainbow has no end that you can hold, but it has a truth you can only find by walking through the mist." Silas began his journey toward the shimmering base of the arch. As he entered the whispering woods, a bird with feathers that changed color in the light fluttered down to his shoulder. "I am Soren," the bird chirped, its wings flashing like jewels. "Are you chasing the light bridge? Many look, but few see." Silas nodded, clutching his prism. "I want to see the colors up close. I want to know where they come from." Soren led Silas into a part of the woods where the mist was thick and gray. Everything looked silver and dull. Silas felt a bit disappointed. "Where did the colors go, Soren?" he asked. The bird flitted to a branch above. "The colors are always here, Silas, but they are shy. They need the sun to dance and the water to reflect. You cannot just read about the light. You must wait for the moment it chooses to show itself." Suddenly, the sun broke through the canopy, hitting a nearby waterfall. The spray erupted into 1,000 tiny rainbows that danced over the rocks. Silas ran to the water's edge, reaching out to grab a handful of violet light. But as soon as his hand touched the spray, the color vanished, leaving only cold, clear water on his skin. He laughed, realizing that the rainbow wasn't a thing to be caught, but a song to be heard with his eyes. They climbed higher, reaching a meadow filled with wildflowers. "Look, Soren," Silas cried. The meadow was a mirror of the sky. There were red poppies, orange lilies, and yellow daisies. Silas knelt and touched the petals. He realized that the rainbow wasn't just in the sky. It was the earth's way of catching the light. A book could name the colors, but only the meadow could let him smell them. A light sun shower began to fall again, the drops warm against Silas's face. He didn't run for cover this time. He stood in the middle of the rain, looking up as a double rainbow appeared. He felt the tingle of the moisture and the warmth of the sun at the same time. He was no longer just looking at the rainbow. He was standing inside the very things that made it. As the sun began to set, the rainbow deepened into a dark, fiery red. Silas held up his glass prism, and the dying light hit it just right, casting a miniature rainbow across his own chest. The end of the rainbow isn't a place, Soren, Silas realized. It's wherever the light finds you. Soren chirped in agreement, his feathers glowing like embers in the twilight. Silas returned home as the first stars began to peek through the purple sky. Elian was sitting on the porch, a lantern by his side. "Did you find the gold at the end of the path, Silas?" his father asked. Silas shook his head and sat down, his clothes still damp and his heart full. The gold was the way the red felt like fire, and the blue felt like the deep sea. "I didn't find the end, Father, because the rainbow is as big as the whole world." That night, Silas placed the prism on his windowsill where it could catch the morning light. He knew that tomorrow the world would be full of new things to see, hear, and touch. He fell asleep knowing that the most beautiful truths aren't written in ink, but are painted in the sky and grown in the grass. He didn't need to follow the rainbow anymore. He knew it would always find him when the rain and the sun met for a dance. The boy who followed the sun. Every evening, Silas sat on the old stone wall behind his house, watching the sky turn from blue to a bruised purple. The sun, a heavy gold coin, slowly slipped behind the jagged peaks of the great West Mountains. "Soren," Silas whispered to his feathered friend, "where does it go when it leaves us? Does it fall into a giant pocket? Does it tuck itself under a blanket of clouds to sleep?" Soren chirped a bright, inquisitive melody. Silas knew that no book could tell him how the sunset felt on his skin or where the light hid at night. He had to see for himself. With his sturdy boots laced tight, Silas began his trek toward the fading light. As he crossed the rolling plains, he met a long-eared rabbit named Glowin, who was hopping frantically through the tall, amber grass. "Are you chasing the shadows too?" Glowin asked, his nose twitching. Silas shook his head. "I am following the sun to find its resting place." "Do you know where it goes?" Glowin paused and looked west. "I only know that the shadows grow long and reach for the mountains. If you want to catch the light, you must move faster than the dark." Silas and Soren climbed higher as the air grew cool and crisp. The world around them began to glow with a strange honey-colored light. "Look, Soren." Silas laughed, spinning in a circle. His shadow was so long it looked like a giant's legs. He felt the warmth of the day lingering in the stones beneath his feet. He realized that the sun wasn't just a light in the sky. It was a fire that warmed the very bones of the earth. To understand the sun, he had to feel the heat it left behind. Glowin led them to the edge of a high, windswept ridge. Below them lay a vast, shimmering desert of orange sand that looked like a sea of fire. "The sun goes there," Glowin whispered, pointing toward the horizon, "into the great copper basin. But be careful, Silas. The light there is so bright it can dance before your eyes." Silas thanked the rabbit and took a deep breath. The journey was far, but the mystery was calling him. Silas and Soren trekked across the dunes. The sand was soft and warm, puffing up like golden dust with every step. Silas reached down and scooped up a handful. It didn't feel like regular dirt. It felt like powdered sunshine. "It's getting lower, Soren," Silas noted, squinting. The sun was now a massive, glowing orange ball, sitting right on the edge of the world. It looked so close that Silas felt he could almost reach out and touch its burning rim. At the very edge of the desert, where the sand met a quiet violet sea, they found an old moss-covered turtle named Hesper. She was staring out at the water, her eyes reflecting the golden orb. "Excuse me," Silas said softly. "I've come from the hills to see the sun go to bed. Does it sink into the water and hiss like a hot coal?" Hesper let out a slow, rumbling chuckle. "Many think so, little traveler. But the eyes can be tricked by distance." Soren flew down and landed on Hesper's sturdy shell. "Then where does it go?" the bird chirped. Hesper looked up at the bird and then back at the horizon. "The sun is a traveler, just like you. It doesn't have a bed, and it never truly sleeps. It is simply going to say hello to the people on the other side of the world. While we wrap ourselves in moonlight, they are waking up to the dawn." Silas stared, his mouth hanging open in wonder. The sun finally dipped below the water's edge, leaving a trail of shimmering sparks on the waves. Silas waded into the surf, feeling the cool water swirl around his ankles. He realized that even though the sun was gone from his sight, the water was still tepid from its touch. He didn't find a pot of fire or a giant blanket. Instead, he found a promise. The sun hadn't disappeared. It had just moved on to share its light with someone else. "I understand now," Silas told Hesper as the first stars began to blink. "I couldn't just read that the world is round or that the sun stays bright. I had to walk until my legs were tired and feel the sand turn from hot to cool." Hesper nodded slowly. "The world is too big for a map, Silas. It must be measured in footsteps and heartbeats." Silas sat with the old turtle for a long time, watching the sky turn into a velvet curtain of stars. Silas returned home as the morning light began to gray the eastern sky. He climbed into his bed just as the first sliver of gold peeked over the Great West Mountains, the very same sun he had followed. He closed his eyes, smiling. He knew that while he slept, the sun would be busy painting the hills and waking the flowers. He fell asleep not wondering where the sun went, but excited to see what it would reveal when it returned to him. The Boy Who Followed the Echo. One crisp morning, Silas stood at the edge of the Great West Canyon with Soren, his iridescent bird friend. Silas cupped his hands around his mouth and shouted a long, loud, "Hello!" A moment later, a voice from deep within the canyon shouted back, "Hello!" Silas tilted his head. "Soren," he whispered, "who is hiding down there? Is there a boy in the rocks catching my words and throwing them back?" Soren puffed his feathers and tilted his head, just as curious as Silas. Silas knew that books said an echo was just sound bouncing, like a ball against a wall. But he wanted to know how the bounce felt. He wanted to see where his voice went when it left his lips. "We must find the source, Soren," Silas said, tightening the straps of his pack. "We will follow the sound until we find the place where the words live." Soren chirped a bright, adventurous note, and together they began their descent into the valley. In the heart of the deep forest, the air was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth. Silas met Arlo, a deer with a coat the color of fallen leaves. "Are you the one who caught my voice?" Silas asked. Arlo shook his head, his large ears twitching. "I only catch the sound of the snapping twig and the rushing brook, little traveler. If you seek the echo, you must go where the trees stand thin and the stones stand tall." Silas and Soren moved deeper into the whispering grove. Silas shouted again, "Where are you?" This time, the answer came back from the trees themselves. "Where are you?" The sound was softer here, muffled by the heavy velvet of the moss and the thick bark of the oaks. Silas reached out and touched a tree trunk. He could feel a tiny, rhythmic hum deep inside the wood. He realized that the forest didn't just hear the sound, it held on to it. The trees began to thin as they reached the base of the high peaks. There, Silas met Shale, a mountain goat with horns that curved like the crescent moon. She was leaping effortlessly from one jagged rock to another. "I am following my voice," Silas told her, catching his breath. Shale paused on a narrow ledge. "Your voice is fast, but the mountains are steady," she said. "To find the echo, you must climb to the great stone bowl where the world is hollow." Soren flew up to join Shale on the high ledge, his bright feathers a stark contrast to the gray stone. "Is it far?" Soren seemed to chirp. Shale looked toward the highest peak, where the clouds gathered like white wool. "The journey is as long as the sound takes to travel," Shale replied, her golden eyes watching Silas as he began the steep climb. She stayed with the bird, watching over the boy as he navigated the shifting stones. The air grew cold and thin as Silas and Soren reached the high peaks. Every time Silas spoke, his voice rang out like a bell, bouncing from one granite wall to another. "It's getting louder," Silas shouted. The mountains shouted back, louder and clearer than before. He felt the sound vibrating in his chest, a deep thrumming that made the very air feel alive. To know the echo, he had to feel the mountain tremble with his own breath. Finally, they reached the great stone bowl, a massive circular valley surrounded by sheer walls of smooth black rock. Silas stood in the center and whispered, "I found you." From every direction, 100 whispers returned. "I found you, you." It wasn't a boy in the rocks, and it wasn't a hidden person. It was the mountain itself, reflecting Silas back to himself. Silas sat on a flat stone, listening to the silence that followed. He realized that the echo wasn't a thing he could catch or put in a jar. It was a conversation between him and the earth. He hadn't just learned about sound waves. He had felt the mountain catch his words and give them back as a gift. "You have to be here to hear it," Silas whispered to Soren. "No map can show you how a mountain listens." As the stars began to peek over the ridges, Silas and Soren made their way back home. Silas's legs were tired, and his throat was a little sore from all the shouting, but his heart felt full. He lay in his bed that night, thinking about the quiet canyon and the whispering trees. He knew now that the world was full of voices, and to hear them, you couldn't just stay at home. You had to go out and speak to the mountains yourself.